Niamh works with the Transnational Institute, which has been around for 50 years now, and is one of Europe's and the world's leading research and advocacy organizations into the area of militarization, and operates with principles of peace and equity and democracy. And like I said, that this militarization going on at the moment is terrifying. Really, it's quite clear that Micheál Martin and the Irish government want to be fully integrated into what's going on. And really the only thing that stands between them and being able to do that is the triple lock. It's such an important thing, and they're going to go after it very, very soon. So it's very opportune that we have Niamh now. So I will hand it over to you, Niamh.
Perfect. Thanks a million, Des, and thanks to People Before Profit for hosting this, and for the members of the different branches for joining. It's really important, I think, that we're having this discussion. So yeah, I'll speak for about 10 or so minutes, but I hope that others then afterwards can ask questions, and we can have a space where we can exchange, because I think with the triple lock, people often feel so uninformed and also intimidated by the fact that they may not have all of the answers to the questions around the triple lock, that they kind of remove themselves from the discussion entirely. So I'm delighted we're having this, and thanks a million for hosting me. So I suppose maybe to explain why I'm involved in this to begin with. So I'm based in Amsterdam, working with the Transnational Institute. I coordinate a program called the War and Pacification Program, and we've been looking very much at the militarization that's taking place within the European Union over the last number of years. We initially were looking mostly at border policies, European Union militarizing borders way down into Africa, quite far east into Asia, and the European Union's militarized policies in that respect. Then we also were looking at the European Union's deployment of military missions in Africa. There's very little that's known about that, but the European Union operates numerous military missions in various countries across Africa. They also have what they call civilian missions, but they have militarized mandates. We also have, of course, PESCO, which has a number of different structures underneath it for permanent security cooperation, and Ireland participates in some of those. We also have Frontex, which is, the European Union's border and coast guard agency, which has been accused of various human rights violations. Even within the EU, they withheld some funding at one point because of the horrific allegations against Frontex. And we also have within the European Union various pools of money running into tens of billions that are being made available either directly to arms companies that will profit from, they're highly lucrative arms companies that are profiting already in their own right, but they're also now dipping into pools of public money. And you also then have joint procurement initiatives being pushed forward by the European Union, so that states are working in, to use their language, interoperably. So this is the context that the European Union is operating in. So the kind of the myth that the European Union is a peace project, that it's simply an economic union or a political union is it's a false. It's a false story, I think, of what the European Union is. The European Union is very much a militarized union. It is, as a matter of policy, has been pushing for the war in Ukraine to continue. It has been fueling the war either directly by sending weapons, but also by, advocating for that war to keep going. And we've seen that very clearly in the last few days even. And then the European Union also, as a matter of policy, has been supporting Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people. So this is the direction that the European Union has been going in for many years. And it's within this context that we must understand the triple lock. So it's not Ireland making a decision to make a legislative change on a domestic issue that is going to be unaffected by this context. It is within this context where we have year on year increased military spending, but year on year we have greater numbers of people being displaced, being killed, destruction from war and conflict, and also the knock-on effects of increased war and conflict on climate and climate breakdown and all of what comes from that. So this is the broader context. Any sensible, right-minded thinking person would say, well, we need to stay well clear of this. In fact, the Irish government under Micheál Martin's leadership, but also the previous government, which was obviously, as you know, a mix of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael as well, yeah, very much dragging Ireland very much into the middle of this. So within that context, we have the triple lock. The triple lock, as you know, probably I presume people here on the call know what the triple lock is. I wrote a publication explaining a bit. I have a copy here. I have a blurry screen so you can't see it, but I'll remove the background when I figure out how to do that and show it. But yeah, I wrote a very simple kind of explainer on the triple lock, and so basically the triple lock requires it's a piece of legislation, and it is about how the regulations are applied to the deployment of Irish troops overseas. So if more than 12 Irish troops are to be deployed on an overseas mission, there must be approval from 3 different entities. So there must be approval from the cabinet, there must be approval from the government of Dáil Éireann, and there must be a UN mandate. So that's our triple lock. That makes perfect sense. If you're deploying troops to a war conflict zone, you obviously need to make sure that you have checks and balances in place to make sure you're not sending them into actually, fuel war, but they're actually being sent in to keep the peace. As Ireland, as a peacekeeping neutral nation, should be doing, and not fueling war. So we have the triple lock in place since within the context of the Nice Treaty, and then reinforced again in the Lisbon Treaty. So if people on the call, I've no idea how old people are on this call, but I imagine people will remember the Nice Treaty and that we voted no the first time round. And the reason why we voted no in many instances was because Irish people simply did not want to be dragged into European Union military structures. And so we voted no, because we had no guarantee that under the Nice Treaty, we would not be dragged into European Union military structures. After voting no, the Irish government, led by Fianna Fáil, Bertie Ahern, if I remember correctly, came up with the notion of the triple lock. And the idea was that the triple lock would give Irish people the guarantees they needed, that Irish troops would not and could not be deployed on an overseas mission unless there was a UN mandate. And because of that UN mandate, Irish troops would be kept out of wars, would be kept out of EU military missions, and that they would only participate in UN peacekeeping missions. So this is the context in which the triple lock comes about. And then we vote yes in the second Nice Treaty, and subsequent to that, a version of the triple lock, as I'm laying out, was written into the Defence Amendment Act. I think it was 2006, because it came a little bit later than the Nice Treaty, but I could be wrong on the date, but I think it was that. The triple lock was then again an issue when we came around to the Lisbon Treaty, because again we voted no, we didn't trust the government that they were going to keep us out of EU military missions, and so the government gave us again guarantees that the triple lock would be reinforced, it wouldn't be touched, and that would guarantee our security, we would be kept out of guarantee us or give us security or certainty that we would be kept out of EU military missions, and we would only be deployed on missions that had a UN mandate. Why is it important to mention that? Because referendums are a central component of the democratic process in Ireland. That is when the people of Ireland are asked to go before the polls and give their opinion on a particular issue. And the people went before the polls in Ireland twice, not once, but twice, on the basis of the guarantees given that resulted in the triple lock, and again in strengthening or reinforcing the triple lock. And now what we have taking shape is the government planning to remove or to revoke the triple lock without consulting the people, and actually giving us very disingenuous argumentation as to why they plan on removing the triple lock in the first place. So I think it's really important that people understand this as a crisis in democracy, to be quite honest. because there's no mandate to remove the triple lock. The government don't have a mandate. If they're so sure that the people are with them on this, then why not put it to the people? But they haven't done that. And so I think it's important to remember the context, because a lot of people will remember those referendums and will also remember how they voted in them. I want to touch a little bit on the different arguments that the government gives when it says it needs to revoke the triple lock. So the first argument that we hear is that the UN undermines Irish sovereignty. If you can imagine that the Irish government, with a straight face, has said, I've quoted in this publication, has said that the UN undermines Irish sovereignty. One of the quotes I've included in this publication is from Leo Varadkar directly, and that if we are to reclaim our sovereignty, then removing the triple lock would be an important step in that process. Now, first of all, the UN undermining our sovereignty is quite a bold statement to make. I mean, the UN is composed of 193 states. If all states started to put forward arguments that the UN trampled on their sovereignty, well, where would we end up? The UN is the most important international organization that we have for international peace and security. Of course, it needs to be reformed, particularly the Security Council vetoes are hugely problematic. But at this moment in time, that's the system that we operate within, the UN system. And we're much better for it than without it, even though it could do with significant reform. But the fact that the Irish government feels emboldened to come out and say it's an encroachment in our sovereignty is particularly dangerous territory. It's a dangerous time to be undermining the UN, particularly when the UN is being undermined on the international front by Israel. When Israel is going after the UN, both literally firing on UN peacekeeping troops, bombing UN facilities in Gaza. More UN staff have been killed in Gaza than in any other war or conflict in the history of the UN. When the UN is the only agency that is, through the international courts in The Hague, through the UN system, UNRWA, through the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories, Francesca Albanese, the UN is an important body, and we must, support it, work within it, and not attempt to act outside its remit. And by saying, well, it undermines our sovereignty is horrendous. Also, it's worth noting that sovereignty in the Irish constitution is vested in the people. So again, we're back to the question of the people. If you do feel that the UN undermines our sovereignty, well, put that question to the people, like you did with the referendums in Nice and Lisbon, and let the people decide. But it's really disingenuous argumentation. It's always focused on this question of there being a veto at the Security Council. And yes, states have a veto at the European Council, at the Security Council, the 5 permanent members. We've all seen how problematic those vetoes can be, particularly in the context of Palestine over the last year and a half. But that is how the UN Charter operates. So if we are to attempt to act outside that, then we are putting a direct challenge to the UN Charter. And now, of all times, is not a time to be challenging one of the most fundamental documents in international law, which is the UN Charter. So really, for the Irish government to come out, and it's bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. And maybe just to mention, before I came on this call, I was just checking the news this evening, and we had Simon Harris making statements, because, of course, the question of whether Irish troops will be deployed to Ukraine is now actually on the agenda, and I'll get onto that in a minute. But we had Simon Harris actually mention how this would, we have a process in place which would involve the UN. So, I mean, what are you doing? Because Simon Harris is saying, and I don't have the quote in front of me because it's on a different screen, but I mean, Simon Harris is trying to, calm people's fears that Irish troops will be deployed to Ukraine, which is a real fear and a likely possibility if the triple lock is removed, by saying, well, hold on, we have this process in place. And he mentions the 3 limbs of the triple lock, but he doesn't say, and specifically the UN, he doesn't say, but at this moment in time, we're actually trying to revoke the UN dimension of this in the triple lock. So this is again disingenuous. It's it's misleading the people entirely on where the government's thinking is at on this. Just the second argument the government will put forward after mentioning the UN and encroaching on our sovereignty, they often say, well, the triple lock shouldn't be conflated with our neutrality. You will find, if you Google a Dáil video from, I think it's 2014 or 2013, I'm not sure, with Micheál Martin on the Dáil floor in opposition, describing the triple lock as a core part of Irish neutrality. So you can actually put Micheál Martin's arguments that he made 10 years ago to him again and say, well, listen, Micheál, you said this 10 years ago. Is that not still the case? You know, what has changed? It was a core part of our neutrality before, but it no longer is. And if we're to take Fianna Fáil at their word now, not their word 10 years ago, if we're to take them at their word now and say, okay, the triple lock is not a core part of our neutrality, imagine that the triple lock no longer exists. And imagine a scenario where we don't have a triple lock, we only have to approve within a domestic setting, within the cabinet and within the Oireachtas. Imagine that a motion comes to deploy Irish troops alongside European troops on an EU mission to Ukraine. Imagine, and we've already had Russia in the last few days saying that they would not tolerate an EU mission in Ukraine. So imagine a mission of that nature is decided upon in Brussels, and Ireland decides, yes, let's send troops on a mission to Ukraine alongside the EU in one of the EU's battle groups, for example. We already know that Russia opposes that. Russia has been very clear. They said that they would consider any such mission as an extension of NATO, and it would be a red line for Russia. We already know that. So as a neutral country, what in the name of God would Ireland be doing deploying its troops on any mission that doesn't have a UN mandate that we already know and have been forewarned is something that would not receive any approval within the UN system? We would be acting outside the UN system. We would be deploying our troops in an EU mission, which would necessarily be taking sides in an active conflict, in an active war zone. That cannot be, there's no conceivable way that that could be compatible with Irish neutrality. It would also, terrifyingly, mean that we would be in direct confrontation with Russia. Russia is a nuclear power. So this is really, really dangerous territory that we are in. If we remove the triple lock, we are in a position where the Irish government can deploy Irish troops on an EU mission to Ukraine, something that Russia has said it will not tolerate and will respond to with force. And if that were to happen, Ireland would be in direct confrontation with a nuclear power. So that's what's at stake if we remove the triple lock. It's essentially the last, bulwark that we have that is keeping us out of such a mission if it were to take place. And if you follow the conversations in Brussels, it's moving slowly in that direction. There isn't a consensus, but we've no idea whether we may end up getting there or not. But I prefer to have all of the safety nets in place to ensure that we don't get there, and not be, removing them so that we're wide open and can be deployed at any moment in time. So the idea that neutrality and the triple lock are separate is a nonsense, and the government until recently actually held that same argumentation. Then you'll often hear the triple lock. This is the third argument. The triple lock isn't fit for purpose. Again, the only purpose that's not served by the triple lock is the deployment of Irish troops on missions that don't have a UN mandate. Often into the mix of this particular argument, you'll hear stuff about cyber attacks. Now, what does the deployment of more than 12 Irish troops on an overseas mission have to do with a cyber attack? it's totally, it's totally a separate issue. You're talking about more than 12 Irish troops that are stationed in the Curragh or whatever, being deployed in an overseas mission. And often you're told about cyber attacks and the HSE in the aftermath or in the middle of COVID. They're completely unrelated questions. Then we're also told about the undersea cables. And my God, if we don't, protect these undersea cables, well, the Russians are coming for us. Well, it actually sounds more likely that we're going for the Russians um, in the current state of affairs, where it's, we're potentially going to form part of an EU mission that will be deployed to Ukraine. But the way this is being framed in the media and by political leadership is that, well, we have to protect those undersea cables. Many of those cables are yes, running through Irish territorial waters, but we don't actually need, for Irish troops, and this is again a total nonsense, for Irish troops to be deployed in Irish waters, the triple lock is not actually engaged. It's like it's like sending Irish troops out on a mission on the land in, the island of Ireland. There's no need to engage the triple lock. If Irish troops are deployed on a mission in Irish territorial waters, the triple lock isn't engaged, and it's a non-issue. There's not a chance in hell that any army, Ireland or otherwise, could protect all of the undersea cables and infrastructure that is dotted all around Ireland's, the economic zone that is surrounding Ireland. That is vast territory. There is no way that Ireland or any other state could be expected to protect those cables. And even if there was a potential attack in Ireland's territorial waters or in the economic zone that is outside of the territorial waters, there's a huge body of maritime law that exists to deal precisely with disputes on the high seas, with undersea infrastructure, with shipping questions. This is often presented as though it's an area that has, it's kind of a gray area where there's no clarity. Actually, there's a whole body of international law, maritime law, to do with the laws of the seas. It's one of the oldest areas of law in existence, in fact. So we don't need to go running to NATO or to the EU or to anyone else to deal with, we can deal with our own territorial waters, and we can resolve disputes within the multilateral system that exists at the UN if they occur. And then also there's lots of scaremongering, the idea that a trawler could drag an anchor along and somehow disconnect Ireland for months and months from the outside world, which is again a total nonsense. There are multiple cables in operation for various things. It would be very stupid if there was only one cable connecting Ireland to the outside world, and if that were cut, well, we'd be out for months, as it's often framed. It's total nonsense. But again, taking advantage of the fact that people may not have access to, all of the information that's available on this. These are the stories that are being spun constantly in the media. And the last argument is often this idea that we must deal with the world as it is now. And the world is, moving towards militarization as a means to protect. And we already know that it's a myth. I mean, the world has been spending more and more on militarism over the last decade. Year on year, there's an increase, but also year on year, there's more wars, there's more conflict, there's more climate devastation. There's absolutely no evidence that spending on your military will actually make you safer. In fact, the contrary is true. It's a myth. If we were to go out and spend, and it also gets you into this logic of, well, when is enough enough? Because if we say, okay, fine, let's get into that logic and think, okay, maybe we should spend a bit more in our military. So what do we try and do? They say, well, we should be spending as much as states of a similar size in the European Union. Why? Why do we have to spend as much as states of a similar? What is that logic based on? There's no actual sensible argumentation for that. There is no correlation between increased military spending and preventing wars and conflicts. Again, like I said, the opposite is actually true. And if you get into that idea that we can only be made safer by increasing our military might, well, then should we also then acquire some nuclear weapons? Should we consider hosting nuclear warheads in Irish territory? Would that make us safer? How far down this road are we prepared to go? And then if we do go down that road, what else takes a hit? So, the other day I heard the opening date for the Children's Hospital has again been put back. The HSE is in dire, people on trolleys, record levels the same, housing crisis, education, we've all of these social services that are already, suffering under the successive governments. But now we're being told, and Michael McGrath, the European Commissioner, was on the radio recently saying, yes, but if we're not secure, then there's not really much point in having, healthcare and social services and housing. But well, hold on a second. If you were to ask someone on the street tonight in Dublin, what makes you feel safe? Is it being able to go to a hospital where there's a functioning health system, or is it that we have, 5 or 6 submarines patrolling the coast in case Russia drops an anchor and detaches a cable? I think the vast majority of Irish people would say access to a functioning health system, a roof over my head, and access to social services. Not, 5 or 6 submarines. I don't know, helicopters. But this is the framing that's coming from Brussels. It's being picked up in Dublin. It's being amplified by and driven also by there's an arms lobby group now that's based in Dublin with membership from Lockheed Martin, Saab, Indra, some of the main arms companies, the biggest in the world. So yeah, again, I'm back to what I started out with, the crisis in democracy, and political decision making, and who is influencing our government and the decisions it's making? Is it the arms lobby? Is it, a for-profit model? Or is it the people who are, if we go back to the question of sovereignty, the ones where sovereignty is vested? So, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I've been talking for a while, and I want to make sure that people can come in with questions and comments. So I think I'll leave it at that, Des. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Niamh. That was very comprehensive, very interesting, and pretty frightening. When you put it there that we could find ourselves very shortly going from being neutral to being involved in a war with what I think is the state with the biggest stockpile of nuclear weapons, bigger even than the United States. That is some leap. And I've just, while you're on there, I was checking. Yeah, and the government does have for its legislation for priority publication, spring session 2025. It says Defence Amendment Bill to amend the Defence Acts to reform the existing provisions concerning the dispatch of members of the Defence Forces for services outside the state. Heads of bill in preparation. So it's coming very, very soon now. So this is where we are now. So I'm sure there'll be people here who maybe have some thoughts, some comments, some questions for Niamh as well. So I think we're going to unmute people, and we've just asked that people just might identify themselves when they speak. So I think it's first Ollie and then Ed.
Thanks, Niamh. It was an excellent outline of the situation and the crisis that's facing us. I just wanted to say that as socialists, you've made our job very, very clear to me, in that we need to be absolutely unequivocal in calling out what lies behind this, and that's our political leaders and their alignment to an ideological identification with the interests of American corporations and American imperialism and our own ruling classes. And nothing else is going on here. Our state already provides a tax evasion services to global capitalism, Western global capitalism, and now they're looking to provide military services in the open, and we need to resist that utterly. I think the point that you made about the quite a to the contrary of to the view expressed that the Russians are coming to get us. In fact, we seem to be coming to get the Russians, which is bizarre when you think about the amount of time and ink and energy and words that are invested in portraying the opposite point of view. So I think we should be very, very clear about our job as socialists in calling out our role to get ordinary people to organise to resist this, and we can resist it. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Holly. Ed, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, thanks. You hear me okay?
We can, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. I mean, the only time that Russia has, to the best of my knowledge, ever threatened Ireland in any way was when they were doing, and they weren't threatening Ireland, but they were doing missile firing exercises off the southwest coast. And Micheál Martin and your man from Fine Gael, his name, during their joint rule over us, were jumping up and down, basically trying to create an international incident, saying, oh, the Russians could be going to cut cables, they could be going to do this, they could be going to do that, they could be going to the other. And the South and West Fishermen's Association said, well, actually, what they're doing, which is unintentional, is interfering with the spawning of the whiting, because where they're holding their missile tests is in the Irish exclusive economic zone, and it happens to be where the whiting are actually spawning on the the continental shelf off Ireland. So government go and ask them to stop it. And no, the government wanted to jump up and down and scream about cables being cut and God knows. So Patrick Murphy from the South and West Fishermen went to the Russian embassy and put the point of view and said, could you please just move a bit further out? And the answer came back, well, we'll have to put it to Moscow, but we don't see why not. The answer came back within about a week to 10 days, saying, sure. And they moved the missile firing tests. I mean, now that is a practical, it happened. That's what happened. And it was the South and West Fishermen went and were polite to the Russians. And the Russians said, okay, lads, it doesn't matter to us, we'll just move a bit further out. But the government would have had an international incident if they'd had half a chance. They were trying to create one. They were talking about the Navy and all sorts of stuff. And I mean, I don't know what the crews are on naval vessels. People around here consider, on the whole, joining the Navy is an indecent thing to do. So I don't know what the crews are, but they could easily be 12 or more. So, but, it really, the government is dangerous. And it's dangerous because they somehow seem to think that it is a kind of a medal of international maturity to be involved in international wars, largely created by the US or the British or one or other of their ex-colonies. And really, this country spent a long time fighting for its freedom from the British Empire. And it really, really should have learned the lesson then to beware of governments of any kind, even our own. And that is a simple, practical example of it. They would have created an international incident if it had been left to the government. They were determined to do it.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for that. I'll go to Marnie and then Nassim.
Thank you very much, Des. And thank you, Niamh, so much for your contribution. I always find your information really useful and we use it a lot. I'm from Dublin Bay North, People Before Profit. I just wanted to sort of discuss a little bit with you the question of the context that you talked about, the militarization and so on of Europe that has been escalating in recent times, as you've not pointed out in a lot of detail. I think right now, though, we have another dynamic happening, which is the Trump dynamic, which is breaking up the EU-US alliance, military alliance, which ironically enough will be easier creates a condition which is easier for Martin to make the point because of people's outrage at Trump. So suddenly the EU is the good one here. And he will have a political, I'm just wondering what you think about that there's an urgency now with all this going on of discussion from Germany and France particularly about, and even Britain to some extent, about increasing military spending, possibly even to 5% in some cases, which is extraordinary. But in the context of the ideological anger, quite rightly, at Trump, suddenly the EU looks a bit liberal or something, which we know and you know better than anybody that it isn't, that it is a warmonger and so on. So I think the focus on Trump is very important for those people like us who oppose dropping the triple lock, to also be in the forefront of attacking Trump. Because, and he's, there's going to be Paddy's Day here, there's going to be people going over, and there'll probably be protests. And we have had good protests in the past on the triple lock. In 23, we had some good stuff around the consultative fora and so on. And perhaps focusing on Trump and saying, no, more militarization is not the answer to Trump. It is about actually neutrality from us and real peace rather than threats of peace and militarized peace, and certainly not boots on the ground in Ukraine. These will be very important because lots of people are so angry at Trump that we should put a perspective that is not a militarized perspective.
Thanks for that, Marnie. Asim. Needs to be unmuted there. Yeah.
Hi. I was just was listening, and I have just actually I was just wondering if the government will not involve people, then how even they can stop this is going to happen. So is there a solution, or do you have something in your mind which you think can stop government to do it, or is just an informational thing that we have to?
Yeah, do you want to come in on that, Niamh, and then we can have another round if anyone else wants to come back in?
Yeah, I can come in on that. Maybe just on the point on the fisher folk and the potential for an incident off the coast of Cork. I can't remember the exact details. I remember reading about it and looking it up again since, but I think that what it shows us is that diplomacy is the way forward, not dispatching an armed military ship. It's resolving the issue on solid ground between, two sovereign capitals, Dublin and Moscow, and not deploying, a naval ship that's armed and planning on taking on the Russian ship that was involved in the exercises. I can't remember the details, but I just remember that it obviously it didn't come to an armed conflict, nor should it have. And it's another example, good example of how diplomacy works. And diplomacy is what we should always be using, and not the warmongering that we've seen coming from Dublin and coming from Brussels and other leadership and capitals. On Trump, I don't think we should put the emphasis on Trump, actually. I wouldn't necessarily go. I think that Trump has actually shown, I think that the US coming out and saying, well, actually, we need peace negotiations. I'm not a Trump fan. I hope I don't need to say that, but I don't think any one of us on this call are Trump fans. I presume we're not, but I'm not a supporter of Trump. But whether we like it or not, he's the first person who has managed to actually get an actual discussion going and actually mention the word peace. I mean, a few years ago, you couldn't say peace without being accused of being a Russian puppet. What was it, a Putin puppet or whatever it was that they were calling us. I think that Trump is very dangerous in many ways, and I'm certainly not a fan of Donald Trump, but I don't know that I would come after him. I was on a webinar actually last night where this came up as well, and the consensus was with various peace groups was, well, look, if he's saying he's going to bring about peace in Ukraine, great, hold him to that. If he's saying he's going to stop the war, hold him to that. Instead of kind of challenging him on what he's doing. I think that I think that I wouldn't shift the attention to Donald Trump because we're part of the European Union, and I think that we have the threat to us being dragged into a military structure is coming from the European Union. So I would keep my focus very much on that. I think that the European Union has been left looking like, with its tail between its legs. It looks completely foolish. And it's also the rhetoric coming from the European Union over the past week when the US has said, okay, we're going to have this discussion now with Russia on what a potential peace process might look like. And Europe is still going, we won't abandon Ukraine, we'll continue to send weapons, we'll keep the war growing. It's like, okay, but you've been saying that for 3 years. Have you nothing else to offer? How long more are we going to continue to say these things? It's like they cannot face up to the fact that people can see what's happening now, So I don't know that I would go after Trump. I would go after the European Union because right now the warmongering in relation to Ukraine is coming very much from the European Union, and all of the movement within the European Union creating funds to arm Ukraine, making vast pools of European public money available through Brussels so that we can arm Ukrainian soldiers or whatever, potentially deploying an EU mission to Ukraine. I would keep my focus on that, not so much on Donald Trump. On the military spending, because you mentioned the military spending, the increase to 5%. I mean, European economies will collapse if they attempt to increase their military spending to 5% of GDP. That's just, the people, we've already heard NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte saying that we should free up money from pension schemes. He spells it out in the European Parliament. Pension schemes, health and social services need to be cut in order to give money to, he says, a fraction of that should go to defence. Again, the same argument, how can we have pensions? So to hell with, retiring with a bit of comfort after working your whole life. In fact, we're going to send this money to the arms companies. I think that's the piece where people will really start to stand up and notice if their pensions are disappearing, if the health system crumbles across Europe because we're building up this massive military machine. I think that hopefully that would be the point when people would say, well, hold on a second. But yeah, 5% is absolutely crazy. And just, I'm not sure if you follow just in the last few days, but the European Commissioner for Trade, Šefčovič, he has actually gone to Washington with, quote unquote, a peace offering. And that peace offering is that Europe will actually buy more liquefied natural gas. They will make deals on cars, and also that Europe will buy more US weapons. And they will align the European system and make sure that European weapons are interoperable with US weapons. That's what Šefčovič is now negotiating in Washington, actually, alongside Trump. Again, you come back to the question of democracy. Šefčovič is unelected, but he is representing the European Commission in European affairs in Washington. None of us obviously voted for him, but he has, he heads up the European Commission in that particular area. So I think there's going to be a lot of bluster about the EU-US relations. I think the European Union realizes that they really are left with their tails between their legs. They're looking like complete fools. They should have been calling for peace 3 years ago. They weren't doing it then. Now they won't do it now. So yeah, I would put my focus firmly on the European Union and not so much on Donald Trump. That's not because I'm a Trump fan. I really am not. He's horrific in so many ways. But I think it's often easier to to put attention on Trump because of all of what we know about how horrific he is, and then all of this other stuff is taking shape parallel to us looking at how bad Trump is. Which is actually stuff where Ireland has a vote and a voice and should be making an impact. And then just on the final point that Asim said, how do we stop this? Well, I suppose that's down to all of us. We have to organise. So, excuse me. Yeah, I think that it would be great if everyone on this call right now, for example, went and said, in their group of friends or with their families, do you know what the triple lock is? Are you aware of what's at stake if it's removed? And have you written to your local representative, your TD or whoever, expressing concern about this? And I think there's a lot of organising happening in the various peace groups, but I suppose we haven't managed to reach a bigger mass of people. And that's, I suppose, why I'm doing this webinar now. I did another one last night. I'm doing another one next week. Yeah, so we're trying to reach as many. So Asim, the task is with you and with everyone else on this call. I think that you take away from this, some of maybe the information we've given in the chat or the discussion or whatever, and really, start to mobilize people to protect the triple lock, and also to say to people before profit as a party, I know you're obviously in favor of keeping the triple lock, but I suppose it would be good to hear also how the opposition is thinking. We met outside the Dáil today for the protest. So the Social Democrats actually came out and took a photo with us and said they were planning on calling for saving the triple lock. Sinn Féin are also on board. Labour have said that they were on board. So how can we make sure that the opposition is united on this? And I think if the opposition is united and comes out strong, then necessarily the media will have to cover that, because the fact that people don't know because the media won't tell them. And I think if the opposition comes out strong on this, and there's a peace movement alongside that, then we might manage to stop it. Excuse me, my voice is going.
Okay. I've got a couple more to come back in, so it's final call for any other hands that want to go up before we finish this section of the meeting. So I'll go to Joe and then back to Ollie. Can you unmute, Joe? Ollie, do you want to go, and then I'll come back to you, Joe, when you get... Joe,
I'm here.
Yeah,
Can you hear me? Great, thanks. Thank you, Niamh. That was really, really interesting. Unfortunately, I missed the first part of it, but it's being recorded, so it would be nice to get some of that information. I think that over the last 3 years, what has been really built up, and very dangerously built up, is this idea that if we don't build up some form of military defense, be it through NATO or now through the European Union, that we build up our own defense forces, that we're going to be invaded by Russia. And they use the Ukraine war, of course, to really scare the living death out of people. And I think that, what has happened in the Ukraine and how NATO has aggressively, its aggressive expansionism has forced that war, and that is not excusing Russia. Russia is an imperialist power, but it's really centered on trying to control its own sphere of influence in Central Europe. Europe is really not its pie, but I think trying to deal with the Russian scare is going to be a really, really important element to this, because we're being bludgeoned by it. And so, using the war in the Ukraine to expose NATO expansionism, I think would be very useful in the whole fight against giving up the triple knock. Thank you.
Yeah, I might actually, before I come back to Ollie, just some thoughts on the Trump question. This is a really interesting one on how to deal with what's happening there, because the man is a monster, and he's not, he's not a peacemaker for some tactical reason that I don't quite figure out what his geopolitical strategy is in relation to Ukraine and Russia. But for some tactical reason, he wants to, get a ceasefire and some sort of peace deal there. But when we look at what he's threatening in relation to Gaza, and and I would imagine Trump wants to focus his war preparations more so on China, wants to kind of shut down the confrontation with Russia and leave Russia and Europe to figure that out, I guess, while he realigns his military and economic war on China. And if and when that happens, it's horrific what could happen there, and the danger would be to the world. So, Niamh didn't do this, but I have heard some people, talking, referring to Trump as as a peacemaker, and that's certainly not a term I would use, because he is just doing some sort of tactical repositioning for much bigger wars elsewhere. So I would find a way that we would articulate it in that sort of way for what is quite a confusing picture at the moment. So. But I'll go to you, Ollie, and then final comments from Niamh, and then we'll be done. Ollie?
Yeah, thanks, Des. And just the thing on Trump is interesting. I think there's a danger if we spend too much time focusing on how horrific an individual is, we kind of miss the point. I mean, he's the empire with no manners and a big mouth, but the fact that he, in a 45-minute phone call with Putin, was able to more or less bring this to an end it reminds us of who our true enemy is, and who the most powerful actor in Europe and in our lives in Ireland is, and that's the United States, and we mustn't forget that. Certainly not a peacemaker. I mean, clearly, 3 years in, militarily, the Russians are going to win this thing. So clearly, they're cutting their losses and leaving. The question of Joe about we're going to be bludgeoned on with the Russophobia, it's absolutely inescapable, and I think we should probably I think we should definitely get into the practice of saying that the Russian ruling class and the political elite they're not our friends, right? But they're not our problem, right? And I think this is something that we should really we should say, and there's a certain degree of risk in that, in that you will really get lambasted if you come out with stuff like that. But I think it's a simple argument, and geography is our friend, the Russians are a regional power. They're not our friends, but they're not our problem. Our problem is a lot closer to home, and it's not the Russians.
Thanks, Holly. Okay, Niamh, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just when Joe was speaking, I was thinking about, I mean, one of the arguments that people were so fearful of making because they were accused of being, pro-Russian, was that Ukraine, as a neutral country, was very safe. It was only when it started cozying up to NATO that it started to have problems. And that's not to justify the invasion, but it's just to set out the facts. And neutrality for Ukraine worked very well. Cozying up to NATO didn't. That's just a fact. Neutrality for Finland, which shares a very long border with Russia and has also got a very complex history. Neutrality also worked very well for the Finns. Now they have decided to abandon it. So neutrality works very well. We know that. We know that in Ireland we have a long history of that. So I think that we really need to, because we're constantly being made to feel like neutrality is an immature position to hold. We need to, grow up and get with the program. And we shouldn't be, bullied into feeling like we should be, for whatever reason, apologetic about our neutral stance. Um, and then just on Trump, yeah, I mean, if we ever wanted an example of how he's not a peacemaker, we can look at all of the horrific stuff that's going on with migrants in the US. The war on migrants. I mean, maybe he's negotiating peace with Russia or whatever, but I think the war on migrants is really, and I was in Latin America when they started the massive deportations, and they're really, it's horrific, and it's terrifying for people. And even the thought that they will send thousands of migrants to Guantanamo, and they will actually use Guantanamo Bay to imprison indefinitely migrants who are undocumented in the US. That's now a proposal. So yeah, Trump is he's not a peacemaker. We know that. Who knows what's going to come of this, these discussions? But I think that we have to continue to call for peace, a ceasefire, negotiations. The rational thinking, and not get dragged into the warmongering, because it won't end well for us. It won't end well for Ireland.